If we could come to order, please. Councillor English, if we could come to order, please. Good evening, members, officers, those of the public with us this evening, and anybody that might be joining us via the webcast. I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's Strategic Planning and Infrastructure meeting, today the 9th of July 2019, being held here in Maidstone Town Hall. Usual housekeeping, if I may. No fire drills planned this evening. If we hear such a noise, consider it to be the real thing, and please follow the instructions of Mr. Nash, who is seated to my right. I'd also like to remind you that this meeting will be broadcast live and playback on the Maidstone Borough Council website. But I'm also going to ask if anybody else is recording this evening. Councillor Mackay, not to prevent you, but just so that others in the room will be aware. And I just see the one indication. And electronic devices, telephones, etc. on silent, if you'd be so kind. To business, agenda item 1, no apologies for absence this evening. Agenda item 2 is therefore defunct and there are no substitute members. Agenda item 3 relates to the matter of urgent items. I have agreed to accept 2 urgent updates. The first relates to item 15, sports facilities and playing pitches strategies approval. The reason for urgency is that following publication of the agenda, the additional information needed to be brought to the attention of members as it materially affects the decision making. Item 19, section 106, legal agreements monitoring report. The reason for urgency is that document clearly highlights to the reader the monies that urgently need to be spent. Mr. Egerton, I think you'd like to say something?
Thank you, Chairman. There are, in fact, 3 urgent updates. The other update refers to item 17, which is the Infrastructure Delivery Plan and Regulation 123 list, which is also provided for members. This was released, I think, a lot earlier, and it's just literally to correct formatting issues in respect of appendices 3 and 4 of the report.
So for the sake of protocol, I acknowledge that that is accepted as an urgent item. You should have all of that information in front of you. I think it would be appropriate just to allow a few moments to familiarise yourselves with that. Let's take those few moments now, and if you can kind of nod when you think you're ready. Councillor English.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, a few moments are not going to be enough to familiarise myself with a complicated and important document like the Section 106 monitoring report. A lot of the update is good, but was needed because there was very little relevant information on the original report. With all due respect, Mr. Chairman, I think it would be much better for the many members who are going to have issues and questions on this if we took this home and put the whole item on the next committee agenda. It's not going to break anyone's bank or anything if we actually do that, and it would give us a chance to actually read this, understand it, and come to the meeting prepared. It's an important subject.
Okay, I think you'd indicated to me earlier that you had some concerns about that. I'd hoped that perhaps this would be the reassurance you were seeking, but I think it's valid what you're saying. What I suggest is that we consider that deferment when we come to that agenda item.
As long as I can be reassured that Mr. Jarman isn't here for that item alone, in which case I'd like to hear it now. Are you here for other items, Mr. Jarman?
Yes, I am, Councillor English.
Okay, the other urgent item papers are somewhat briefer, and I believe you all seem to have indicated you've looked at those now, so we shall move on. Agenda item 14, we will make a note of visiting members. If I could ask such people to come to the speakers table, announce themselves and indicate if there are any items they wish to speak to. Councillor Spooner, perhaps we'll start with you.
Spooner from Bearsted Ward.
Just to stay for an hour to listen and observe. Thank you very much.
That's noted for the record. I think you are the one and only this evening. Agenda item 5, disclosures by members and officers. Are there any disclosures, please? None indicated, therefore none noted. Similar question at item 6, disclosures of lobbying. Are there any disclosures of lobbying, please? No indications, therefore none noted. Item 7, the matter of exempt items. There are no yellow papers this evening, members. Is it agreed everything should be taken in public? Thank you. Agenda item 8, the minutes of our meeting that was held on the 25th of June 2019, circulated with the papers. I trust you've had a chance to consider those. Councillor Wiggenden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to refer to item 22, Lewes Neighbourhood Plan. I'm going back to this blessed field we were talking about, and it is said that we did not take this at the meeting because it was not constitutionally possible. That actually was not the objection at the meeting. The objection was it was inappropriate to use our position as a planning authority to advance our position as a landowner. So actually this is factually incorrect.
So that amendment is proposed by yourself, seconded by Councillor English. Do all members agree that that should be amended? If you would indicate, please. Anybody disagreeing? Anybody abstaining from that? One abstention. I think we're actually one short on that count. I'm not sure if you voted, did you, Councillor Mumford? Right. I thought you were, but it was unclear. So that amendment is taken and shall be reflected in the signed copy. Other than that, are you content that I sign it as a true record? Thank you, members. Agenda item 9, there are no petitions this evening. And agenda item 10, there are no questions from members of the public this evening. However, I would note that we have a request from Mrs Prendergast to speak to item 17 relating to the 1, 2, 3 list, and I've agreed that she can do so. And for the completeness of record, I also have a statement on that item from two of our own councillors, Sam's. They're unable to be present this evening due to a family bereavement, but I shall read their statement on their behalf in connection with that item. Under agenda item 11, we can consider the committee work programme, pages 8 to 9. Do any of the officers wish to identify anything in particular? Mr Nash.
Thank you, Chairman. So at the last Strategic Planning and Infrastructure Committee meeting, a report was requested regarding signing statements of common ground. Democratic and Legal Services have looked into this, and it's clear that it falls within the authority, delegated authority of the Head of Planning and Development. I'm happy to circulate some written guidance on this after the meeting, but on that basis, I'd like to remove that item from the work programme. If, of course, you come back with any questions, then perhaps it could be re-entered onto the work programme at a later date.
So, members, what I'd suggest there is it remains on the work programme at this time. If you read the note and have further concerns, I would ask that you would contact myself and the Vice Chair, and then we can see that a full report does come forwards. But if you are content with that, perhaps the Vice Chair and myself will be minded to remove it on the next agenda setting. Councillor Wiggenden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to ask a question about the conservation area appraisals and management plans programme and what will be included, what is intended to be included in that. The reason I'm saying that is because one of my parishes had a conservation plan which was completed but then not adopted by this authority, and are keen actually to make sure that that's included going forward.
My recollection from last time is that it is a fairly broad item. Mr Jarman, can you confirm that such considerations will be included? There was also a request from another member concerning the mechanism to extend a conservation area as well.
I think one isn't working. Yes, broad's the accurate term. It's the main focus of the report is to get some kind of prioritization, because obviously we can't do all the work on new conservation areas, extending conservation areas management plans. Some things are more important than others, and obviously we've got clear timeframes as well. So it's what I call a prioritization report, and from that we get a program.
Does that satisfy your query?
Yeah, so I'll just be in contact with Mr. Jarman about it.
I'd like to raise a matter under the work programme as well. I'm intending to bring a report to the September SPI meeting on the 10th of September on an Article 4 direction on 14 sites in Maidstone town centre.
Councillor Mrs Grigg.
Thank you, Chairman. I found myself thinking before, when I look at this committee work programme on occasion, that we do have the lead mentioned here, who is bringing it forward, and also who the report and author. But we don't often know who actually is the motivator behind it, or who has requested for it to go onto the committee. I wondered if it would be possible for us to add an extra column in order for us to know that information.
Mr Nash.
Yeah, certainly that's something that I'll take back to the team and we'll look into.
Councillor English.
I would support that, although in a few cases it might be hard to pin down. On the conservation area thing, I think that what I would say to people is that to a large extent the consideration here is going to have to be evidence-based on the priority, essentially what demonstrable need and how factors like how many planning applications, etc., are coming in these particular areas. In other words, the stress that this could be addressed. So there's a lot of factors to be taken into account. I was just wondering, though, I mean, as a broader point, we are now getting to a very heavy agenda for the September the 19th. Are we certain that we're going to be able to cover all of these quite important? I mean, the conservation area one alone is going to be a significant time factor. Are we confident that we're going to get all of those very important subjects covered in one meeting? I know we should try for it, but perhaps we should do some contingency planning at this point.
I think what I would say is if you would be prepared to leave that to the discretion of the chair and the vice chair. I think it's a regular juggling act, and often things aren't quite ready as planned, and we'll manage that workload accordingly. Are you more specifically asking, should we set a reserve date?
Well, I think some of these things are so important. Some of these things are so important that, to be honest, personally I'd rather bite the bullet if necessary and come back twice if I had to, rather than put them off for a quarter.
Okay, I think let's say that your comments are noted, and Vice Chair and myself will give that due consideration, and if we sense that, we'll get early notice of a reserve date if the work programme begins to demand that, and we can get it in our diaries. If that concludes, final word from Councillor Wiggenden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to answer just one thing. I accept Councillor English's point about not wanting to start things like conservation areas from scratch. I was specifically mentioning a report which was completed some years ago, which might need some work, but they would like it adopted for certain, as it wasn't done last time.
Councillor English, if you would go by the chair, please, and use microphones when speaking. Okay, that's noted. Can I just confirm that we note the work programme? Thank you. Moving along, agenda item 12 is really only for noting as well. There are two reports I think you've all had chance to read. I think it might also be worth just mentioning that the cycling meeting is also the AGM as well as an open meeting, I think, isn't it, Councillor English? So it's for people's information. Are the reports noted? We can now move on to agenda item 13. This is the outcome of the low emission zone feasibility study in Upper Stone Street, and I'm going to ask Dr. Maxwell to present this for us.
Thank you, Chairman. So our report explains the outcome of the feasibility study which was undertaken earlier in the year into the possibilities for some kind of low emission zone in Upper Stone Street. This was one of the most important actions from the low emission strategy which was adopted by the Council at the end of 2017. Air quality in Maidstone Borough is improving. At the time the low emission strategy was adopted, we envisaged a low emission zone starting as a pilot area in the High Street and subsequently being rolled out to other areas. However, the downward trend in pollution levels now means that the High Street already appears to be compliant with all of the air quality objectives. It was therefore decided to shift the focus of this study to Upper Stone Street. Upper Stone Street has also seen a clear downward trend in pollution levels in the past few years. However, the starting point was much higher. At one location, an annual average nitrogen dioxide level of 95 micrograms per cubic metre was recorded in 2015. This decreased steadily in subsequent years, but by 2018 the level had only decreased to 77 micrograms per cubic metre, compared to an objective of 40 micrograms. This feasibility study has modelled 3 measures which could be implemented in Upper Stone Street. These 3 measures were chosen from a long list of 28 which was developed at a workshop which we held in February. The 3 measures were: scenario 1 was a red route, which means no stopping on Lower Stone Street, Palace Avenue and Upper Stone Street between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Scenario 2 was a cleaner and more efficient vehicle usage scheme, which meant working with freight and bus operators to try and get cleaner vehicles on Upper Stone Street and to reduce the number of vehicle movements. Scenario 3 was a Category B clean air zone, which would have entry restrictions for buses, coaches, taxis, PHVs and HGVs. These were not the most draconian measures from the long list, but were chosen to be reasonable and balanced with a view to minimising inconvenience and to avoiding shifting air quality problems to neighbouring streets. We've asked the consultants who undertook this work to attend this meeting to give a very brief presentation about the work and to be available to members to answer any of their questions. With the Chairman's permission, I'd like to introduce them shortly, but could I just firstly say a few words about the decision which we're asking members to make this evening. In terms of bringing forward compliance with air quality objectives, none of the measures modelled were very effective. The best of them was projected to bring forward compliance by 1 year from 2028 to 2027. With the possible exception of the second one, the measures could not be implemented without the support of KCC. We're therefore requesting members' agreement for the Director of Regeneration and Place to explore at a senior level at KCC the appetite for implementing one or more of the measures in Upper Stone Street. However, it's also clear that Maidstone Council and in all likelihood KCC will not have funding for such measures. Therefore, implicit in getting support from KCC is the idea that KCC and MBC will jointly apply to central government for the necessary funding. At a meeting of the full council on the 10th of April, Maidstone Borough Council declared its recognition of the global climate and biodiversity emergencies. Consequently, the Chief Executive wrote to the Chancellor of the Exchequer requesting financial support from the government to tackle environmental issues. This letter also referred to poor air quality in the borough and made specific mention of this feasibility study, and the letter's in Appendix 1 of the report. A reply was recently received from the Minister for Universities, Science, Research and Innovation, which mentioned a couple of funding sources aimed primarily at energy efficiency rather than air quality. And in fact, the reply did not specifically mention air quality at all, excuse me. In the view of officers and our consultants, in order to obtain funding for the measures described above, we would need to apply to DEFRA's Joint Air Quality Unit. However, in 2017, in response to a grant application for an air quality project, DEFRA advised that Maidstone is not a nitrogen dioxide priority area. This despite us reporting all our air quality monitoring results to DEFRA annually. We therefore feel that a more persuasive case would need to be made to DEFRA to have any chance of obtaining funding for an air quality project in Upper Stone Street. However, the risk is that if DEFRA acknowledge the air quality problem in Upper Stone Street, they may direct us to implement a solution which brings forward compliance with the air quality objective in a shorter time than the measures so far considered. There's a further risk that they may also still fail to provide funding. So it therefore seems prudent to establish support or lack of support within KCC at this point before exposing MBC to any further risk. Chairman, could I have permission to introduce our consultants to give a very brief presentation about that?
Please do so.
So we have Dr. Nick Ayland on my left from ITP, who did the traffic modelling for this study. On my right is Dr. Paul Manctolo, who did the air quality modelling. I think Nick is going to do the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. I won't take very long on this because I think Stuart's summarised it quite neatly. But what I would say is just what I'll do is give you a little bit more detail than Stuart's given you, maybe with some pictures as well. The background to the study is that we were asked to consider low emission zone type measures to improve air quality on Upper Stone Street. And that's the area that Stuart referred to, where air quality is currently much worse than the national air quality objective of 40 micrograms per metre cubed. As you'll see on that little map up there, these are the 2017 values, but you've got one value of 79.3, which I think went down to about 77 in 2018. So that is very significantly above the national objective. As Stuart indicated, we started off from a long list of 28 potential measures where we drew from experience in other cities and towns in the UK and overseas. We did a qualitative multi-criteria assessment, and we also had a stakeholder workshop here, which I think some of you were at. And from that, we agreed with the officers 3 scenarios that we could then test using a combination of traffic data modelling and air quality dispersion modelling. Scenario 1 that Stuart mentioned is having a red route, or introducing a red route, which is effectively a no stopping zone on both Upper and Lower Stone Street, and the one we modelled would operate from 7 AM to 7 PM. And the reason for doing that would be that it would smooth traffic flow significantly and avoid the disruption caused by vehicles stopping for unloading, for example. And you get quite a lot of that on Upper Stone Street at the moment. And by that decongestion measure, you can actually reduce emissions quite significantly. That would need to be implemented, as Stuart said, by Kent County Council using a TRO, and it would need enforcement to be effective. The second scenario we looked at is one that could be introduced by Maidstone Borough Council, but it would be quite expensive, and it would involve working with freight operators and bus operators to introduce lower emission vehicles into their fleets, and to work with them on scheduling their vehicles to try and keep the most polluting vehicles away from Upper Stone Street. It's something you could do yourselves in theory, but as Stuart said, you would need a significant pot of funding in order to be able to give out grants to such operators. The third scenario we looked at is based on a charging clean air zone where non-compliant vehicles who don't meet specified Euro emission standards would be charged for entering a defined area. And the scheme option that we looked at would involve charging HGVs, buses, taxis, and private hire vehicles that don't meet those emission standards. And for modelling purposes, we assumed a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week operation because the air quality standards are based on an annual mean. And we assumed a £50 per day charge for HGVs and buses, which is very similar to what's being proposed in other areas of the country, and an £8 per day charge for taxis and private hire vehicles. Although the model that we used assumed that that would not be introduced until 2025, largely because those particular vehicles don't appear to be contributing a lot to the air quality problem. Again, this would need to be implemented by County Council using a charging scheme order and would again need to be enforced by cameras. In terms of the air quality results, air quality would be expected to improve in the future due to technology improvements in air quality regulations anyway. We're seeing improvements from cleaning up of the vehicle fleet and emission standards taking effect. Nevertheless, the modelling that we did showed in particular that Upper Stone Street would still exceed the air quality objective until 2028, which is a long way into the future without any further action. All three scenarios were predicted to deliver, and we say, substantial air quality benefits, and that's based on a specific scale that's used by the Institute of Air Quality Management, but on Upper Stone Street, but limited benefits elsewhere. We found that a Class B charging clean air zone is predicted to have the greatest benefit, but would only bring compliance forward by a year, as Stuart said, to 2027. We felt that I think it's right to say, although we haven't tested it, that a more stringent clean air zone would bring compliance forward potentially by an extra few years, but that has not been tested. And the implementation of measures to bring Upper Stone Street into compliance would require joint working between the Borough Council and the County Council, and would almost certainly, as Stuart said, require additional central government funding. Thank you.
Councillor Mackay is indicating I'll start with you and then I'll move clockwise.
Thank you. I won't pretend that I read every word of the report. It was way over my head, I've got to say. But I know where Upper Stone Street is, and I can understand the first scenario of no stopping in Upper Stone Street. And that strikes me as being relatively low cost. Clearly has an impact upon businesses in Upper Stone Street, but I'm sure that can be mitigated in some ways, what I would hope. You mentioned that all three, that's included number one, would have significant benefits. On a scale, what impact, I'm sure it's in the report somewhere, but what impact would just introducing, and this is not my recommendation, it's just a question, just introducing scenario one, the red line, what impact would that have on air quality?
Yeah, so as Nick explained, we looked at the impacts in relation to air quality guidance which is put together by the Institute of Air Quality Management, which takes into account the levels of air quality in relation to air quality objectives and what the change in air quality is with the intervention. And using that guidance, we were predicting substantial air quality benefits on Upper Stone Street. I believe it was a reduction of around 1.5 microgram So the objective is 40 microgram, and that was the reduction.
Sorry, in percentage terms?
Couple of percent or so.
Yeah.
It's about 2 to 3%.
And that's considered significant?
It is when you're well in excess of the national air quality objectives.
It's a start, let's get on with it.
Yeah.
Councillor Garton.
Looking at the three scenarios, I think scenario 3 is probably the most draconian one. We're talking about possibly a £50 charge. Now, if I drive a lorry and I have to pay £50 to go through central Maidstone, or I take the risk of getting a 1 in 2 year penalty ticket to go through Leeds, I think it's a no-brainer that I will take the illegal road through Leeds. I think this option would only work if we have a Leeds relief road of some descript or another. Scenario 2 would probably work for local business and local transportation companies and buses. We have quite a substantial amount of foreign lorries travelling through Maidstone. This would not address the issue of foreign lorries through Maidstone. So that leaves me back to what Councillor Mackay already mentioned, the scenario 1. I think it's very cost effective. It not only enhances the traffic, the air quality, but it enhances traffic flow as well. We've got a problem with traffic flow in Maidstone throughout. It requires a consultation, a couple of metal boards and a pot of paint, and therefore I would very much like this option particularly to be taken forward to KCC. And if we come to a decision tonight to take something forward to KCC, this should be enhanced and underlined.
Mr. Chairman, we've moved on to the debate. I thought we were on questions, because as a ward member, I'd really like to come in early on this debate, if we've actually started a general one.
I think you left the room at a certain point on this, so things have... Well, I indicated we started with Councillor Mackay and we're moving clockwise, and it's debate and questions. Councillor de Wigenden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a couple of things. I mean, I wish to start with, to pick up on the point we've just had about the number of haulage companies we have, and you said that the most effective thing was be scenario 2 to deal with the haulage companies and with other operators. But that will be expensive and would need an amount of money. But actually, how many haulage companies actually come through this borough, and how many would we be dealing with, both national and international? And we're talking about the amount of money it would need. The second point I have, which is linked to that, is this authority is in regular contact with DEFRA, and it gives its reports on its air quality. And they say that we're not an air quality priority area, and yet those are the people we want some money from. You then say that these things will be, I mean, we all want, let's be serious, we all want improved air quality, but none of these improve it more than a year, and yet it's going to cost money. Actually, we haven't heard about, I'm not quite sure how much money it said it would be. But actually, it would be a lot of money we don't have, and the people we're asking it from don't seem to think we're a priority. So I'd like a little bit more on what would be the reality of getting some money for this, especially as it would only improve it for 1 year. Granted that I would want it, but actually, how likely is that? I do take the chap's point about a red route on Lower Stone Street, Upper Stone Street. Of course, during peak times, that's the very opposite of a red route, and nothing moves at all. So, that's a long way to go on that.
Something you started by saying about the routing of HGVs, it's my understanding this is the official route across Maidstone. Willington Street is not. The Leeds Village is a banned route. This is the official route for all freight to actually transit the town, as I understand it. It's the approved route.
So how do we actually, so if we're going to do this number 2, and you were saying about, you know, having a pot of money to contribute towards hauliers and others towards having cleaner vehicles or doing something else, how many entities will we be dealing with, and what is the estimated cost of that?
I suppose the simple answer at the moment is we don't know, because this is just an initial study, and to go out and actually do a survey would cost more. In terms of the amount that it would cost, you'd have to do the survey first, and then you'd have to look at the amount of subsidy that you might provide for upgrading vehicles, retrofitting vehicles, etc. But that would all, I think, I mean, you're not going to find that sort of sum of money either in Kent County Council or Maidstone Borough Council, I wouldn't imagine. But central government, if DEFRA are persuaded that actually you do have an air quality problem, that is the sort of thing that they would fund.
I think one of the issues we have here is we're looking at piecemeal solutions to a national problem. And actually the most effective taxation attack on these vehicles is one that's done nationally with excise duty and even fuel. And I think before us we already have evidence that improved technologies is improving the situation. Paragraph 1.5 is one that I hang my thoughts around. It particularly peeves me that the identified canyon effect, which I think I've sat and talked about many times in this room, and yet actually it's us that are building, you know, pretty close to the canyon line, shall we say, in there, and you know, our best intervention is the one that we've already squandered ourselves, and it becomes quite hypocritical to me. No, Councillor English, I better have a word with those chaps on the planning committee, but yes, okay, and just something else to take into account here, in looking at the data that's expressed in 1.5 and beyond, because I got a little bit confused by this, so some clarity. We're looking at 2017 data, and then we start talking about, for the official reporting, you need a calendar year of some description, and that's a current period. And it does strike me that we've actually got some additional temporary roadworks exasperating the issues there currently of our own making, and that would lead me to suspect that data set if it's a current period as well, so I think that's worth noting. Temporary pedestrian crossings and adjustments into the carriageway or into the highway space, which must have an effect. So my comments, I go back to, you know, it's a piecemeal solution to a national issue, and I think we should look at it in those terms. And in terms of our further collaboration with county as the Highways Authority, rather than be asking the director to have a conversation particularly centred around this, I would like us to be encouraging a conversation that gets some assurances around air quality modelling taking place alongside the traffic modelling, which is necessary to inform us for the best spatial distributions that we may have yet to consider. You know, and there's other planning measures that I think we should begin to think about. You know, the emissions from household boilers, I have read, can be 40% of the contribution. I don't know whether that's correct. It might be myth and hearsay, but there's another set of factors as well that play into this, particularly within a canyon environment. So, you know, it's all good work, but I'm not seeing a cost-benefit ratio jumping out of pushing for a spend in this one area when we should be looking at it as a macro planning issue, as instructed by the inspector. Enough of my say. Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chairman. I really do feel that we should explore not just scenario 2 with KCC, but scenario 1. I've been involved with traffic orders at the county I think it costs £2,500 to put the weight limit in Lewes Valley. I know it's slightly different because of the enforcement cameras, but I would be astonished if it would be anywhere near £1 million. I would like, if it's not been proposed, or if you have proposed, I'll second. I think we should move this forward and have KCC look into it. We're looking at a traffic order, lining, and some sort of enforcement. And I just think that the flow for traffic will improve congestion. There's a lot of problem with children crossing the road, especially to get to and fro buses, and parked cars are a nuisance and a hazard, and I think we could do something much more than just air quality. I think we could improve general safety at that point. So if that wasn't proposed, I'd like to propose that we move that forward with KCC.
So for clarity, are you proposing the recommendations per the papers? No. Then can I ask you to be specific with your words?
I'm proposing that we move forward with scenario 1 with KCC. Developing the idea of a red route for this area, because I think there's so many. We may only slightly reduce the benefits to air quality, but everything about it aggregates. We will stop the moment that we install this scheme, and we will also improve throughput. It's a major throughway for articulated lorries, as you mentioned earlier. So as soon as a small van can stop a lorry, which will back up to the gyrator, I think there are just so many benefits that we should carry on exploring option 1.
I think there are already some enforcement measures to prevent that happening. To capture what you're saying, I think let's be clear about what we are seconding if we are. So I think it's currently per the papers with an addition, Mr. Nash.
So what I've tried to capture here to reflect your comments is an amendment to number 2 on the paper. So it would be that the Director of Regeneration in place assess the level of support from Kent County Council to implement one or more of the measures outlined in the report, with an emphasis placed on option 1.
I'm sorry, Councillor English, I'll invite you to speak, but the proposer needs to respond to the clarification of the words.
Yes, I'm limiting my thoughts to option 1 at this stage. I think we should move, if we need to split the recommendation, that's fine, but I think we should move forward with this red route for this area. I think it would have major benefits to the borough.
So can I ask you to be specific how you want those words changed? I could come back to you if you want a moment to put that together. Councillor English, I know you've been anxious to speak on this.
I was just going to propose a wording if...
Suggest that in collaboration with the proposer for a moment.
I think, if I could help the proposer, we're just saying that after the word implement in recommendation 2, implement scenario 1.
So to implement, so the assess the level of support with county to implement scenario 1. Yeah. And you don't want the discussion to have a fallback position if they are completely opposed to that option.
I can't see why they would be. It's a traffic regulation order. It's minimal cost, frankly.
Okay.
As I say, I've previously done traffic orders. Weight limits in the valley, 2,500. 1,000 of that is actually just distributed leaflets. So I think it's... the cameras are going to be expensive, but I'd be absolutely astonished if it's anywhere near £1 million.
I'll be astonished if you get change out of $1 million, having seen some of these things. But your wording is clear. You've caught that, Mr. Nash. It's seconded. No one else wants to speak. And this is specifically in relation to recommendation 2. Before we go through the recommendations, may I seek a clarity on recommendation 1? The word endorse is used. We normally note. Is there a significance to you asking us to endorse rather than note? Dr. Maxwell.
I don't think so, Chairman.
Okay.
I'm happy if you note it.
So I, from the Chair, propose that item 1 is that we note the findings, do not necessarily endorse the detail. So can I have a seconder for resolution by Councillor English. Those in favour of noting? That's unanimous. That's dealt with easily. Recommendation 2 is proposed by amendment. We vote on the amendment and then the substantive motion, if that's so. Those in favour of this amendment? Those against? That amendment is carried and it becomes a substantive motion. I'm looking for some clarification. If that was a vote for an amendment, whether we need to vote the substantive. We do,
Chairman,
as I understand it.
I did have some further comments to make on this, which might lead to another amendment, or not.
We'll deal with that motion and then I'll allow you some further comments.
But if you pass the motion, the debate's over.
There's another piece to actually come as well. Councillor English, if you want to make comment before we take that vote.
Well, I think that the reasons for not proceeding with 2 or 3 at this stage are quite cogent, but what does occur to me is that there may be other things that we can do here. I note that the council has elsewhere applied for a significant grant for street trees, whereas some of this street is quite difficult. There is an area of this street where planting the relevant species of tree to reduce air pollution would not be difficult. Secondly, perhaps you would prefer this as a separate motion, but I think the council needs to get a grip of what it can do itself. The technology, as you rightly say, is moving quickly. We have a report elsewhere in the council about technology which we can apply in our own car parks, and on-street parking has also been addressed in Kingston Borough Council, for example, in London. It's about time we get a grip of the way that we perhaps should be addressing this, is that we should be looking at using technology to introduce differential parking regimes on-street and off-street within the Borough Council's area.
Okay,
now, I think that might be a separate...
I'm going to pause you there because this item is specific to Upper Stone Street. I think there's merit in what you're saying, and it is something that we have discussed under an item in its own right. So,
okay, I'm prepared to withdraw on the grounds that a further report on that will come to this committee and be added to the workload. But the trees, I think, are relevant.
Okay. Trees in the specific... Mr. Jarman, you're probably going to talk about opportunity sites or something now? Because they're just down the road and you could put some trees in.
I wasn't specifically, Chairman, but, you know, I know you said it jokingly, but I would like further research done, analytical research done on this canyon effect, because obviously in the local plan review we'll be coming up with some fairly specific design guidance, and obviously I suspect that we will be faced, this committee will be faced with some high-rise, for want of a better description, proposals in the town centre. So I think it's very important to get a much better understanding on exactly what this canyon effect is. Is it sort of 2 factors, that the buildings are just way too high and close to the carriageway, so that's creating this Grand Canyon? And as Councillor English said, is it because there's a theory that if you have a setback, certain species of trees, I assume it is only certain species, absorb the majority of the nitrogen dioxide? Well, yeah, I'm not an expert on this, but I think...
So,
because, as you said, Chairman, the canyon effect is referred to, but there's no analysis of the magnitude of it.
I think canyon effect is a known factor. Are you asking... I think we're going beyond the brief of this item, and I think there's a local plan contribution. We've got air quality very much on the radar then, and I think, Mr. Jarman, that would be the moment to bring that piece of work in, rather than attach it on the back of this now. I think it's a broader... We want broader guidance principles understood for future development in all locations, and I think that should come through the air quality stream.
I'm not. I just. I think you're right, Mr. Chairman. I think, Mr. Chairman, you're right that that particular point does go beyond the remit of this report, but I think it is worth exploring at a later point. I would say that we have raised, the Planning Committee did raise this, and we're still in dispute about where some of our ward councillors as to whether actually what was built was what we agreed, but that's another issue. But on this particular Lower Stone Street issue, I would like us to explore the possibility of applying for a grant from the relevant government department to actually plant.
Did you say Lower Stone Street?
Sorry?
Did you say Lower Stone Street?
Sorry, that was a slip of the tongue. Upper Stone Street.
Upper Stone Street.
Because there is an area. There are two areas where I believe it would be eminently possible and achievable, although I accept your point earlier that it's not all the way down the road. But it's something we can look into relatively cheaply, I think.
Right. So the question is who looks into whether that's part of the remit we're giving to the director now, or it's a separate thing you're proposing?
I would like it incorporated in the motion as an additional point.
Specific, please, with the words that you intend to.
This committee instruct the head of regeneration or his relevant officer to explore the practicality of mitigating the air quality impact in Upper Stone Street through selective planting.
I think that should be taken as a separate resolution rather than combined with this one.
I don't mind how it's done as long as this committee instructs.
I'll come back to you when we've dealt with the motion before us. I'm mindful that we've got the consultancy. I'm also mindful this item is taking somewhat longer than perhaps we'd anticipated. The broader issue of canyon effect, I think, needs to feed into policy development for the local plan rather than more detailed explanation tonight, albeit I understand we may have some expertise here. Right. Councillor Clark's motion, as seconded by Councillor English. I'll explain why I won't be supporting it, because I think it narrows the brief too much. But those in favour? Those against? Abstentions? But that is carried. That was the conclusion of recommendation 2. Let's deal with recommendation 3, which is simply that a report will come back to us at a later date. Those in favour? That's unanimous. Against? Abstentions? It was a unanimous. I wasn't sure whether I saw your hand on the first moment, Councillor Mackay.
With a great deal of reluctance, yes, I'll support it.
Right. To wrap this item up then, Councillor English, would you like to propose your further suggestion for planting?
That this committee instruct the Director of Regeneration to investigate the scope for planting, for a planting scheme to mitigate the air quality in Upper Stone Street.
Seconder? I've already done it. Councillor Clark, those in favour? Those against? No abstentions, carried. Councillor Wigan, the item is closing.
I'm just taking up Mr. Jarman's point. As the canyoning was mentioned in this report, I see no reason why we can't have a motion saying we would like a qualitative report on the effect of canyoning to inform our work going forward.
I don't think, I think we're broadening and broadening this. That will be I believe, part of the work on air quality as we develop those policies specifically. Because there will be design guidance principles that need to be established. We're going to close the item. Councillor Mackay, but I'll give you the last word.
So just a question then. So we have decided that scenario 2 would not be taken forward. Is that right?
We've instructed the Director of Regeneration in place to push for scenario 1, and there was no fallback position in the instruction.
Then can I record for the minutes that I strongly object to that, or whatever the terminology is?
You want your dissent noted? Mine also, Mr. Nash. That item is concluded. Thank you, gentlemen. We must move on. Agenda item 14, Maidstone Strategic Infrastructure Collaboration Board. As per the papers, pages 162, 163, Chief Executive Mrs. Broom, would you be kind enough to present this for us?
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. In March this year, Maidstone Borough Council and Kent County Council agreed to establish a strategic board to facilitate discussion by both authorities and other relevant partners on major strategic projects, and that a terms of reference would be established by the 30th of September. This was one of the elements of the agreement made to resolve Maidstone Council's JR challenge to Kent County Council. Since then, there have been officer discussions as to the terms of reference. We took the initiative and produced a series of drafts which have been discussed and shared with KCC officers. So the objective of this report is to consult with your committee, which has a key role in the delivery of infrastructure, on the possible terms of reference. So in other words, I'm looking for as clear as possible a steer as to what would be acceptable to you in terms of the terms of reference. So with the aim of being helpful, I've structured the considerations into 3 key elements: the purpose of such a board, its aims, and what the membership should be. So the purpose is set out, my stab at that purpose, at paragraph 2.6, which I'm sure you've read, and I don't need to add anything any further. The aims are set out in paragraph 2.6.1. The point that I would just like to draw attention to is that what we're suggesting is that the board would be an official forum for the Borough Council and the County Council to demonstrate the discharge of our duty to cooperate. And obviously that's important in the context of the local plan. The membership that is suggested, at least for the purposes of discussion this evening, is set out in paragraph 2.7. Putting this section together, I've drawn on the experience of the Maidstone East Strategic Board, suggesting that we keep the board small and that there is a blend of elected members and officers. And I know that the chair of your committee is part of that board and may also want to comment on the effectiveness of it. The difference between this board and the Maidstone East Strategic Board is that it's proposed that both our MPs should also participate. Both of them are keen to do so, and I think one of the benefits of that is that it gives us perhaps better access to government ministers in our attempts to lever investment into the borough for infrastructure. The other consideration, simply in terms of transport infrastructure, relates to the Joint Transport Board. There's no suggestion at the moment that that board should disappear, but it would remain for perhaps more operational matters. So once projects have been identified and agreed, that's a good place for monitoring, and it would continue perhaps also to deal with the consultation feedback on traffic regulation orders as it does at the moment. Just in terms of the feedback that we have had from County Council, the point I made earlier was that the dialogue has been with officers, and I received the latest update from the corporate director at the end of last week, which is just to advise that there has not been perhaps as extensive a discussion as we're likely to have this evening with yourselves, but I do anticipate having some feedback when the director returns from leave later this week. So the recommendations are set out on page 162 of your agenda, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions or to take any of your feedback on board. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm conscious of a full line of indications to my left, but just to start proceedings, can I make one small suggestion which relates to the paragraph concerning the chairing of this board? So based on personal experience of the Joint Transportation Board, where the chairmanship alternates 1 year to the next, there's always a sense of, oh, that authority's in charge this year, they're going to get it their way, and then we're in charge next year, which isn't the case, but it's not a helpful sensation. And what works extremely well with the Maidstone East Strategic Board is that we have co-chairs, one from each authority, and they actually alternate the chairing of the meetings, meeting to meeting. It works extremely well, and there's flexibility within that as well for them to cover each other, or when one had lost her voice on one occasion. It's simple practice, but it actually fosters collaboration. So I would ask, Chief Executive, that you take that thought, and I'm looking to see whether the committee support that idea. There's support for that. Yeah. We may need to record it formally, or is the steer sufficient for you, Mrs. Broom?
Well, I'm sure we can note it in the
we'll note that in the
record
conclusion.
of
So
the meeting. That
was my starter for 10, and now I'll start on my left with Councillor Mrs. Grigg.
Thank you, Chair. I have no issue at all with the scope of this board, but I do have to take a very big issue with the membership of this board. And I'd like to know how other members feel, and I'd also like to ask the question, because I do not understand why, when this is a strategic and infrastructure board that is looking at the much bigger picture, not the minutiae of property ownership, housing, that it makes sense to have the chair and vice chair of P&R and just the chair of strategic planning. This is a strategic board. It should, in my opinion, be the other way round, because the other thing is there's a lot of collaborative work between the chair and the vice chair on this committee, and in order, I think, for the residents of Maidstone to benefit from anything that this board can offer, it would inhibit that work if any vice chair of this committee did not understand the full picture of the strategic or the strategic picture and what it's trying to achieve. It's literally asking you to do that job as vice chair of this committee with one hand tied behind your back. And I would like to understand the reasoning when it's a strategic and infrastructure board that there is the chair and vice chair of P&R and just the chair of strategic planning on it.
I think it is worth reminding this committee that this is the decision-making committee concerning bids that will be made by infrastructure providers for the SIL pot as it develops. And I think what Councillor Mrs. Grigg is saying, that having that continuity feeding into this committee, this is the infrastructure, that there is a logic, but I think it's worth remembering that we're in the SIL hot seat. Councillor Clark.
Yes, Chairman, I totally agree with Councillor Grigg. There are 55 members on this council. When I was reading through the papers, my concern is almost as if there's a chance that we might lose control of infrastructure. I do understand it's not, we're the decision-making body, but we are the most strategic committee for infrastructure, transport. The fact that we only have a single member on this board, I just find it folly in comparison to having the chair and vice chair of P&R. So I would definitely like to propose that we change this mix and we have the chair and vice chair of SPI on this board and only the chair of P&R, because I think that better reflects the purpose of this committee and the fact that members can come through SPI, work with the vice chair, work with the chair, and make sure that they have some level of representation on the board. And I'm not sure that we're doing that at the moment.
Councillor English.
I would agree with my colleague. Either this is a strategic infrastructure board that's working largely in the planning and infrastructure area, or it isn't really. And if it's about property and money, then that I think it should be called something else and have a different remit. And not that there isn't some relevance of property and money, but the primary purpose of this board, as I read the remit here, is in the strategic planning field. And it seems to me that as a local authority we are handicapping ourselves, we're certainly handicapping this committee, if we have just one representative. I think that it is far more logical to change it round the other way. If we were arguing, and I look at the justification cited in the papers, if that was the logical reason, the deputy leader of the council should be being proposed, not the vice chairman of P&R. So it doesn't even add up on that score, if you ask me. So I think that we should change it in the way that Councillor Clark suggests.
Are you seconding?
Yes, I am.
I think the Chief Executive alluded to me saying something about how the Maidstone East Strategic Board has worked.
Yes.
And part of its success has been keeping just 2 members from either side. An easy solution to this dilemma would be for us to say, let's add a 4th member. But I would strongly share with you the experience of Maidstone East Strategic Board. Its effectiveness has been a few members. And bear in mind, neither that nor this as proposed is decision making. It's about collaboration growing and being able to tie into the governance process at both authorities. So my experience says keep it small. An easy get out is add one. Councillor Mackay. I think that Councillor Clark has proposed an amendment at the moment. Councillor English has seconded that amendment, and Councillor Mackay would be the next person to speak if he wishes to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, I'm not overly keen on new committees being set up, but I'll support it because I would like to see Maidstone Strategic Infrastructure Collaboration Board set up. Because when something doesn't happen that has been agreed by Maidstone, I know where to go. And everybody will know where to go. So I'm not really that bothered about who's, it seems reasonable. I could tinker at the edges as Councillor English and Councillor Clark do. But I'll accept it. But when a strategic plan has been agreed by this committee and it doesn't get implemented, we know where to go. So I will support wholeheartedly this and wait to see it deliver.
Worth reminding ourselves, I think, that sometimes we have policy that relies on other infrastructure deliverers to actually deliver. So we can have a policy, but we don't have the authority to force something through. This is a measure aimed at generating collaboration with one of the significant providers, education, highways, and other considerations. I think I share your view, another committee, another forum. This is something that we're legally bound to do from the settlement agreement agreed by both authorities. Can I just ask...
Can I just say, Mr. Chairman, I'm getting worried about our agreements.
Possibly some of us share those worries, but it is what it is. Can I ask for another point of clarification, Mrs. Broom? The purpose of this board is to, or one of the duties is to discharge the duty to cooperate. Does that come into the realms of agreeing the statement of cooperation that may be found through that duty to cooperate?
I think it will be a place where consensus can be sought around statements of common ground, but as you quite rightly highlighted earlier, it would not be a decision-making environment. So decision-making would need to be taken care of by other provisions within each of the council's constitutions.
Which in the case of statements of common ground is, we were told earlier, a delegated authority to officers here. Okay, Councillor Mumford.
One member's already mentioned logic, which is my favourite. There's an explanation of why we've got these board members in 2.8, and it doesn't convince me. And before we go any further, I'd like to go back to the author, ask what logic was used to put the vice chair of P&R in, as opposed to the logical one of our vice chair, and additionally, what would be the impact if this committee voted an extra member to this board, i.e. the vice chair? So it's really two questions. What's the logic of it? And what would be the impact of adding an extra member to this board?
Mrs. Broom.
Okay, so the suggestion has been that there would be 3 elected members from each of KCC and ourselves. There's nothing particularly magic about the number 3, and that's just a working assumption at the moment. It could be 2, could be 3, but I'd suggest that the bigger the number gets, the more unwieldy the board becomes. And certainly, having been part of the Maidstone East board, along with the chair of this committee, I'd say that I think one of the reasons why it works well is because it is a compact board. So my advice would be, if you can, resist the temptation to make things bigger and bigger. But I do understand the desire to be inclusive. In terms of who should participate, I've put forward a suggestion. And the reason for suggesting a combination of contribution from the Policy and Resources Committee and this committee, so Policy and Resources to have the council's overall strategic oversight for the reasons set out here. So the leader has very specific responsibilities for delivering the council's vision. And if you think, recently we've adopted a new strategic plan, and one of the things that is different about that plan from previous ones is the specific emphasis on embracing growth and enabling infrastructure. And also he has, the leader has the responsibility for coordinating policies and building consensus around council priorities, which I think is an important role to be carried out as well in this infrastructure board. you've already articulated the reasons for involvement from a member from this committee as part of the board. And then, frankly, I think it's a fairly evenly balanced argument as to where a third member, if there were to be three, is drawn from. What I would say I don't agree with is that the Policy and Resources Committee are involved in lots of minutiae, and that's the contrast between P&R and your committee. I don't think that that's right, but I do understand the desire for this committee to have very prominent involvement in the board. And if you wish to see a different composition from the one that I've suggested here, then you make that decision, and I will take it into the negotiation with KCC. And if we're 3 members, then that's what we'll pursue.
Satisfied with the answers, Councillor Mumford, or do you want to come back?
No, I think I'm satisfied, and I don't want to make the board bigger, and I think I will be supporting the motion.
I think it would be wrong not to call a spade and to identify the elephant in the room of logic. So there is another logic to where we are. This is about building collaboration with county. It's something we need to do within our own authority as well. So the leader of the council, we may not all agree with, but the democratic outcome is such that that's one person. The other person might happen to be the leader of the largest group, which means there's a position that enables consensus to be met. So there is another strand of logic, albeit I think this committee and the Vice Chair's participation here is actually a lot closer to the issues themselves. But what you actually have is quite a fine balancing act between building consensus across this authority, collaboration with the other authority, and the pure logic of who's best up to speed with the gritty issues to be able to participate knowledgeably. That I think is actually the balance. Councillor de Wigandon.
Thank you. Yeah, like yourself, I do not think we need to add to the members of the committee. I do support that the position that the 2 members should come from this committee, and I think that's the most appropriate way to go. I have to admit, I have 2 points. When I first saw this was called a collaboration board, I was concerned because obviously we haven't always got on, and collaboration actually has 2 meanings. One, like to deliver a product or something together, and secondly, traitorous cooperation with the enemy. And I really do hope we're going for the first, because actually we've not always worked so well in the past. Secondly is how this is going to work with the JTB, and the Chief Exec was pointing out that this will actually take the decisions, and the JTB will pick up the consultations and the grumbles and the complaints. And it sounds like this is, JTB will become some kind of subordinate committee, picking up all the grumbles. Whereas actually, if this board is going to make the decisions, it ought to pick up the brickbats itself.
Mrs. Broom.
Okay. So, as things are set out in this report, with the caveat that we don't have a complete picture at the moment as to the position of the County Council, the strategic board would be much broader than transport. So it would cover all types of infrastructure. That is how certainly I would like to propose that sort of scope is appropriate. And the reason for that is that for Maidstone as a borough to be successful as a place, then we need to think about not only transport infrastructure, but other things as well. And I've sort of indicated some of those things in the report. And to my mind, we need collaboration on all of those and a common position on all of those to be compelling and powerful in our endeavours to secure investment to make that infrastructure happen and to work with utilities, for example, the health sector and so on. So I think that's one very big contrast with the Joint Transport Board. One of the things that the Joint Transport Board is it's broader in scope. JTB just covers transport. I move on to your the second point that I would like to make. One of the things that the JTB is currently responsible for is transport strategy and the infrastructure around that. To my mind, if we're talking about the most strategic infrastructure, then the consensus around that would become the responsibility of the Strategic Infrastructure Board. But the other things that are in the terms of reference currently would simply remain with the Joint Transport Board. And I think if you were to try to mix the two things together, you would significantly dilute the ability to be able to work on the strategic issues. Now, clearly there needs to be an understanding, as there does in every realm, between strategy and policy and action. If the membership of the board from a Maidstone perspective is, as we've discussed this evening, then the chair of this committee is in both places, in both the Joint Transport Board and on this Strategic Infrastructure Board. So the read across should be possible as well as through officer support.
Did you want to come back?
It was more about the accountability and answerability of it, because the intent is, I see the point. It's interesting to see. It'd be interesting to see how it's intended to work in practice. But my point was rather that, have one board which is making the decisions, and any consultation or feedback goes back to the other one. And I'm not sure that's right. Unless I'm getting this wrong, that's not how that would work.
I think the first thing to say is this is new territory. It's untried. It could be an outrageous success, or 2 meetings down the line, we might be needing to look at something different. But where I do see this working is this committee is tasked with distributing the SIL pot. That's a huge responsibility. It's not enough money, but it's a lot of money. We don't have a forum to sit down with our colleagues up the road to actually talk about, is it education that we need to push first? Is it a bit of highways? Is it something to do with health? And so it could be all sorts of things, but this is the forum to have that chat, and then it comes back here as a recommendation. And I think this is where the power of the vice chair being there as well, because it's a 2-strand golden thread of continuity coming back to this committee. But that's the forum to talk collaboratively. It's then to bring back the feel of that and possibly a recommendation to this committee, but this committee's the decision-making bit. That's how I could see that this works, and that is quite different to JTB, where it's very specifically about we've got 20 TROs and 3 objections, and Mrs. Smith at number 9 won't be able to park, and disabled. That's a minutiae and some strategic as well, but this is different. Mr. Jarman.
To echo what you said, this is a great opportunity, I think, for genuine strategic collaboration. And currently, there's a vacuum there. So, as you said yourself, you're in a very powerful position as SPI to divvy out the SIL money, but it will be reactionary without that strategic collaboration.
So, Mrs. Grigg.
Thank you. I understand what Councillor Mackay was saying about having the extra board and that you don't particularly care who's on it as long as, you know, it's going about its business. But surely, if we want to solve this infrastructure issue, we want this board to work. We want it to be as efficient as possible. The last thing that we need is another high-level board. We need it to be a pragmatic board. And in my opinion, to get that, we have to have the right people on it, and this is not efficient as it currently stands.
So we've had sufficient. So the first vote is the amendment proposed in relation to the makeup of the board. So you've proposed that it be chair and vice chair of this committee plus the leader of the council. Yes, okay. Those in favour? Those against? And abstentions? That amendment feeds into what we have on the papers in front of us. I'll quickly go back to my screen, which timed out. 2 seconds. Right. Let's just dot the I's and cross the T's. So the recommendation is that the agreement through the settlement agreement be noted. Is that noted, members? The proposed arrangements for the board, including its purpose, aims, and membership, which is as amended by resolution, be agreed. I think what we'll do is we'll go through that, and then at the end, we'll actually have a formal vote on block so that there's a record. For the purpose of discussion at the first board, yes. So this is going to be an evolving thing, and as proposed, you'll have direct line feedback through 2 voice channels as to how that will. Delegated authority is to be granted to the Chief Executive to make changes to the proposed arrangements and agreed terms of reference with other members of the board, KCC, MPs, in consultation. And this would now be modified to say the chair, the vice chair of P&R, and the chair of this committee and the vice chair. I think I've duplicated words there. It's the chair of P&R, chair of this committee, and the vice chair of this committee. So we all clearly understand that that's... and just as a side note, you know, there's another big party to this, which is KCC, and they may have some, which is why the chief executive needs to be able to meld the two together with some negotiation. And the representatives is confirmed but modified, as we have said. Right, so 1, 2, 3 and 4, reflecting the amendment concerning membership. Those in favour, please. I should probably have gone through the process saying, proposed from the chair and need a seconder. Councillor English was there. So proposed, seconded. Those in favour? And those against? And abstentions? Carried. Thank you, members. That concludes that item. Thank you, Mrs. Broom. We've got a couple of chunky bits yet to go through. Are we minded to push on, or is there any need of a comfort break for 5 minutes? Right, five-minute break, and then we crack on with the rest of it. Thank you. Yeah.
Chair and vice chair.
Yes, yes.
Just the chair and
Who happens to be
recognised.
Yes.
Vice chair P&R, you're...
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Somebody won't be happy, but I do think... but it was broadly supported.
Snap. So it's the chair of P&R and the chair and vice chair of strategic.
So I know the compromise which was obviously being discussed was you have the leader of the council working in collaboration with the biggest group in the council. supported by the overseeing chairman, who's also the Conservative. And so they've just kind of to get their own bloke out of it. So one day just turn around, just turn around and say, well, we have all 4 for that one. I don't get that. Anyway.
and then it could go. If we could resume our seats, please. And we reconvene the meeting at this time. Agenda item 15 is our next item of business. Sports facilities and playing pitch strategies approval. And Mr. Egerton, if you would be so kind.
Thank you, Chairman. At the meeting of Strategic Planning, Sustainability and Transportation Committee on the 5th of February 2019, the committee approved the sports facilities and playing pitch strategies as part of the evidence base for the local plan review, subject to 3 amendments. The strategies also feed into the work programme of the Economic Regeneration and Leisure Committee, as is, which is currently undertaking a 2-year scrutiny review of sports provision in the borough. As evidence-based documents to support the local plan review, the strategies would not normally have been presented to the committee. However, should members wish to take forward the recommendations set out in the strategies, and there's no duty to do this, there are potential financial implications for council-owned facilities. The strategies can be used as evidence base for grant funding bids. Specialist consultants completed the strategies in accordance with Sport England guidance on how to undertake assessments. The strategies identified the need for new and improved facilities, and the methodology comprised individual site surveys and liaison with sports users and providers to establish the quantity, quality, accessibility and availability of facilities. Following analysis, the results were subject to key stakeholder engagement, including with members, prior to the 5th of February 2019 SPST meeting. The amendments to the strategies approved on the 5th of February comprise the inclusion of Mangravet Recreation Field in the playing pitch strategy and the inclusion of Pegasus Gym and Heavenly Fitness Gym in the sports facilities strategy. These matters were subsequently discussed with the consultants, and to include the sites within the strategies at this stage would involve additional consultancy work and costs, including site surveys and engagements with key stakeholders that would need to be undertaken in accordance with the Sports England guidelines, resulting in a delay to the publication of the strategies and also resource implications for the team. In an attempt, though, to find a way forward that is suitable for members, we've had a think and had a discussion with the consultants, and to try and avoid further delay and costs in publication, we've produced an urgent update that includes 2 further recommendations to the report. So, just looking back at the 5th of February resolution, first one was the sports facilities strategy be approved as part of the council's evidence base for the review of the Maidstone Borough local plan, subject to the addition of Pegasus Gym and Heavenly Fitness, and the playing pitch strategy be approved as part of the council's evidence base for the review of the Maidstone Borough local plan, subject to the addition of Mangravet Recreation Field. Taking Pegasus Gymnastics Club first, what the Gymnastics Club does is provide specialist gym facilities. So the Sports England methodology required assessments of the new specialist facilities to be focused on a sub-regional or regional analysis of need, as opposed to meeting a borough need. Paragraph 1.4.2 of the sports facilities strategy explains that one-off specialist sporting facilities, such as climbing facilities and gymnastics facilities, have been specifically excluded from the sports facilities strategy on this basis. Consideration can be given to including these when the strategy is next reviewed. Taking Heavenly Fitness Gym, although the Heavenly Fitness Gym is still operational, the facility was excluded from the sports facilities strategy because it's allocated for housing development in the adopted Maidstone Borough Local Plan 2017. Consequently, it could not be relied on as future sport provision. The site's potential will be given consideration through the reviews of the sports facilities strategy and the local plan, and this position can be made clear by the inclusion of an addendum which is included in the urgent update. And there is a recommendation which is to include an addendum in the sports facilities strategy to state that Heavenly Fitness Gym has been omitted from the strategy due to the site's allocation for housing development in the Maidstone Borough Local Plan 2017. The site's potential for future housing development or sports provision will be examined through the review of the sports facilities strategy and as part of the local plan review. Finally, Mangravet Recreation Field. Following completion of the playing pitch strategy, which was undertaken in accordance with the Sports England guidance, attention was drawn to the omission of Mangravet Recreation Field from the strategy. The Kent Football Association had no record of clubs using the field, and despite significant stakeholder consultation, nor was the omission of the site from the playing pitch strategy raised by the governing bodies of sport, the users, and providers of pitch facilities, parish councils or members. This is not uncommon, given the unpredictability of the formation and disbanding of football clubs. Such omissions would normally be addressed through a review of the strategy, which accords with the Sports England guidance. As a consequence, the consultants did not include the recreation field in their survey, analysis and consultation for future pitch provision, and the site was not subject to qualitative assessment and availability assessment. A review of the sports facilities and playing pitch strategies will commence in January 2020, so in 5 months' time, to support the review of the Maidstone Borough local plan. At that time, the need for new sports facilities and pitches will be updated to reflect the future growth in population and any changes in provision. So to highlight this position and to avoid further delays in publishing the strategy, and as a result of additional consultancy work, it's recommended that an addendum is included in the playing pitch strategy to confirm that Mangravet Recreation Field will form part of the considerations when the strategy is reviewed, and that is set out in the urgent update. Therefore, there are 4 recommendations for the committee to consider. Thank you.
Thank you for your introduction. Councillor Clark, I think it was you that raised this originally. The floor is yours.
It was, Chairman, and I have to say I was very disappointed, given it's been 5 months, to find out just before this, the papers, that all 3 that had been agreed at this committee unanimously were not going to be included. I do welcome the urgent update based on the feedback that I gave about that, and I do welcome the inclusion of the Mangravet playing field for review. However, I'm very disappointed about the other 2 facilities. They're both in my ward. I think that regardless of the fact that Pegasus Gym has a particular focus that may go beyond the borough, it is a sports facility within the borough. We don't know what may or may not happen with Pegasus going forward, but one thing we do know is that we have a sports facility there, and I really do think that because it's such a major facility, even if we don't do the consultation work at this time, we should include it within the report. We should make mention of it. We shouldn't say this site will be, this facility is being excluded from the report, because I just feel it's incomplete. And it goes against the recommendation from this committee that these 3 sites be included in January. And I feel that that was a democratic decision, and it should have been carried forward. The Pegasus, the Heavenly Gym, Heavenly Fitness Gym. I do understand it's a site that's allocated in the Maidstone local plan, but I think that actually means that we should include it, we should even have more reason to include it, because this is a site that potentially could be lost. And when we look at provision within the borough and we look at housing allocations and what happens on that site, we can look at the fact that we are losing a facility. So I think if we exclude it because it's in the local plan, we don't know whether that site will come forward or not. It could be there, there could be a gym in 20, 25 years' time. So I just feel for completeness, I welcome the point that's subsequently been made on Mangravet playing field, but I do believe that both of these other facilities should be mentioned in the report, even if it is a placeholder and it doesn't involve further consultation, consultant work at this stage.
Officer response.
What I'll just do at this stage is just say to Councillor Clark, just some reassurance actually. The recommendation, there's an additional recommendation which has regard to Heavenly Fitness as well. So it isn't just Mangravet which is subject to a recommendation. There's another recommendation in the urgent update which also deals with Heavenly Fitness as well. So hopefully that it acts as a placeholder.
No, I actually am referring to the urgent update, and it essentially says the inclusion is the Heavenly Fitness Gym has been omitted from the strategy due to the site's allocation for housing development in the Maidstone Borough Local Plan 2017. The site's potential for future housing development or sports provision will be examined through the review of the sports facilities strategy as part of the local plan review. I think that we should make reference to the fact that this is a current sports facility in the borough, because we're almost completely sidestepping that by saying it's a policy in the local plan. If we lose it, we need to look at what we do to mitigate that loss to the borough.
I just wonder if we're not maybe missing the point slightly. This is an assessment of what we've got against then a projection of what we need. If we include it, we're including something that we might not have, which reduces the need. So I think, yes, because if we assume it's still there and it does become a development site, then what this report is telling us about what we should be looking to provision for in the future is a reduced quantum, because you could end up double counting. So, you know, well, that's how it reads to me at the moment, but help me, Councillor English.
Can I quickly just come back? This was a democratic
I'm
decision.
sorry, Councillor English has the...
I don't see what the problem is for simply including a few additional words. I think recommendation 1, by the way, on Mangravic covers the point, so well done on that. And saying the site's potential for future housing development or sports provision is okay as far as it goes, but the additional point should be or alternative sports provision on another site, or replacement provision, or however one wants to word it, because that is what we're talking about, isn't it? So that just covers all the bases.
This is where I thought the recommendations for future need from this are based precisely on that worst case scenario.
But clearly, Mr. Chairman, if we put it that way, the review will be picking up the very point you made, and so I don't see the harm in adding or alternative provision on another site, because that covers all of the issues. We're not committing the council or the committee to doing that, we're just making sure that we don't omit it.
Sorry, your microphone, please.
Oh, sorry. In terms of the Pegasus Gymnastics Club, I don't really see what the big problem is for actually just make a single line referencing its existence. We're not consulting on anything, we're just mentioning it's there. And I don't really see what it's a fact. It has a sub-regional, even national, even international significance given Olympians of successful Olympians, but it also has a local factor, and I don't see what the problem is with simply putting a line in the reports mentioning it exists.
I don't think we're going to fight on this tonight. It's evidence-based material. I'll come back to you for a specific set of words about how you want it amended in a minute. Councillor Mackay.
Anyone looking at a sports facilities and playing pitch strategies for Maidstone Borough Council will be very surprised that one of our jewels in the crown is not even detailed in it. If it cannot be included in it because of a technicality, it should be mentioned almost on the first page that this is a facility that we're proud of, that is a regional and national facility. So Councillor English refers to one line. I think it deserves more than one line. I will take it on board that you can't include it in your evidence-based report. But in all reports, there is an introduction to what it is, and I think it should be there, and it should be a major part of it, as should Maidstone Football Club be, by the way.
Okay, we're going to move on. I'll be coming back to you for that one line, or more than one line, as you put it. Councillor de Wiggendon.
Thank you. Referring to the 70 for this, I take the point of the Councillor Clark that, you know, if this site goes, you would want it replaced, and I think Councillor English made a very useful suggestion on that. But also, I think your point was, Mr. Chairman, saying we're assessing what we don't have, and we're actually counting that it's not going to be here. The point is we have allocated it as a site, and presumably, I don't remember, the criteria for developing on that site did not include replacing the gym. So, I mean, so we have actually already made the decision that that site is likely to be redeveloped for homes. The criteria we put on it wasn't that the gym should be replaced, and therefore we're in a position where we ought to be looking forward. Yes, that's there, but we have already made a decision that actually that won't be there in the future. And like you say, Mr. Chairman, we should not be counting it and saying, we know this is going, or assuming it's going to go, and therefore should be seeking to source an alternative site as part of this plan. I see what you're trying to say, but I think we have already made that decision on that allocated site that part of the terms are not at the moment, that a gym would be replaced, and planning, it would thus be rather awkward to make those conditions.
Okay, let's see if we can move this along. We have that backstop that it's reviewed in the context of emerging spatial strategy in 5 months or so time. We have the recommendations per the paper. We have 2 additional recommendations. I'll ask now if there is to be any further amendments specifically.
I did propose on the second one that we simply added to cover all the bases, and
the second one being
the second additional recommendation.
Yeah, right. Recommendation 4.
In relation to the Heavenly Fitness Gym, the site's after the site's potential for future housing development or sports provision, or the possibility of replacement on an alternative site be examined.
Right, that's your...
Yes.
So may I ask that somebody moves incorporating that, and then we haven't got to go through substantive amendment. So you're moving all 4 recommendations with that change to 4.
I also want to pick up, I don't particularly care where it goes, whether it's in the body of the report or the introduction, but so I'm happy to, but I want to see a reference included to Pegasus Gym because it is of national and local significance. But a separate vote on the 2. If
need to be specific. So are you saying recommendation 5, Pegasus Gym is recognised as a Maidstone facility and it should be further evaluated at the review?
At the review, not at this point.
Yes. Mr. Egerton.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, councillors. I just wanted to clarify one point. Is it possible for that extra text to be inserted into the proposed addendum rather than in the previous reports?
As I said, I wasn't fussed about where it appeared.
So what I just said is 5 will be include an addendum to
the sports facilities to state Pegasus Ground
yes.
recognised as a...
Right, so I just... Yeah, Mr. Fitzpatrick, if you could read those words just to nail it.
All right, here we go. Include an addendum in the sports facility strategy to state, open quote, Pegasus Gym is recognised as a Maidstone facility and will be further evaluated at the review. At the... Yeah, and shall be further evaluated at the sports facility, the local plan review.
Yes. The review in 5 months' time.
The local plan
so
review.
So that is
yep.
recommendation 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4 amended as you suggested, plus 5. You move, Councillor English, you second, Councillor Clark. Those in favour? Unanimous, therefore carried. Thank you. We find ourselves at agenda item 16. This relates to the Mardon neighbourhood plan, regulation 16. Mr Egerton, you again.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, councillors. So there's two types of neighbourhood plan, those with site allocations for mainstream housing and those without, broadly speaking. Mardon have taken quite a pragmatic approach to their neighbourhood plan and chosen not to include site allocations for such mainstream housing. And this means they rely on the allocations contained in the adopted Maidstone local plan. But they also avoid potential issues associated with housing sites. And as a result, Mardon have recently been able to move very quickly, actually, through the neighbourhood planning process. Contact with the parish council has been maintained during the preparation of the Mardon neighbourhood plan, and officers have offered advice and support to the parish on a range of issues. The parish has afforded officers the opportunity to informally comment on draft iterations of the plan, and it has responded positively to the advice which has been given. The parish council undertook a 6-week public consultation on the pre-submission version of the Mardon neighbourhood plan, which we refer to as Regulation 14, between the 9th of June and 21st of July 2018. Following consultation, the parish council has amended the plan as appropriate in response to all consultation representations. The current stage of public consultation is on the submission version, which we refer to as Regulation 16. Prior to the plan submission for independent examination. The Borough Council is responsible, in fact, for facilitating this consultation and has agreed the consultation dates with the Parish Council being the 14th of June to 26th of July 2019. We are also responsible for checking the requirements for a strategic environmental assessment with regard to this plan, and I confirm one is not required. And we're also responsible for appointing an independent examiner so they can test the plan against what's referred to as the basic conditions contained in your report on page 448. Finally, the Council gets to make representations on its ongoing consultation. Paragraph 2.11 sets out the main matters that are considered in the neighbourhood plan, including the conservation and enhancement of the natural and built environments, the expansion of education and healthcare facilities, and provision of affordable housing on rural exception sites. The Mardon neighbourhood plan is inclusive and well written. Its policies are considered to be in general conformity with the strategic policies of the Maidstone development plan. However, the text of the plan requires some minor correction and greater clarification in some areas, and these are set out on pages 449 to 450 of your agendas and form the basis of Maidstone Borough Council's proposed representation on the Mardon neighbourhood plan contained as Appendix 1. Finally, just to remind the committee that the Head of Planning and Development has elected not to use his delegated powers, and so the report comes with recommendations that the committee adopt Mardon Maidstone, that the Marston neighbour, sorry, my apologies, that the Mardon neighbourhood plan be supported and the council's representation on the Mardon neighbourhood plan attached as Appendix 1 be approved. Thank you.
Members, you'll forgive me for starting on this one. Indulge me because this one is in my ward, and I almost feel like the record repeating what we've heard said about other plans, but the Mardon Neighbourhood Plan Group have put an enormous amount of effort into developing this document to the standard that they have, and they are, of course, to be congratulated. I think also remind ourselves this is Mardon's plan of their own creation, in general conformity with the current local plan. But this is Mardon's work, and it's not our place to make major changes on something that they've publicly consulted and look to take to referendum shortly. I'm happy to move as per the papers, but congratulations to the team there. Councillor English.
I just want to formally second the motion and say how much I agree with you. Mardon Parish Council have indeed done this very speedily, but it seems to be a very competent job.
Councillor Mackay, did you want to comment? Your name card.
For once, no. Oh, beg your pardon.
Okay. Without further ado then, to the vote, those in favour? Unanimous and therefore carried. Agenda item 17, infrastructure delivery plan. Mrs. Smith will be presenting this. Then I have a statement to read from Councillor Sams, and we also have a visiting speaker. Mrs. Smith.
Thank you, Chairman. This report, as per the title, explains the process by which officers have undertaken the first annual review of the Infrastructure Delivery Plan, or IDP, and the Community Infrastructure Levy Regulation 123 list since their publication in May 2016 and October 2017 respectively, and it also sets out the reasons for doing so. By way of a brief explanation, the IDP is a living document, and it shows a snapshot in time of the borough-wide infrastructure requirements needed to sustainably deliver the proposed development within the adopted Maidstone Borough Local Plan. The latest IDP review actually began in December 2018 when I made initial contact with infrastructure providers. The review has resulted in updates to ongoing projects to reflect their current status, the removal of 27 completed projects, and the inclusion of 7 new projects. The IDP is included in this report to members in its draft form for information and as evidence to the proposed changes in the Regulation 123 list. It does not require public consultation. Pending members' decision on taking forward a revised Regulation 123 list to public consultation, the IDP will be finalised and then brought back to this committee for noting an agreement to publish later this year. So no action is required from members this evening in relation to the IDP. Onto the Regulation 123 list. The purpose of the Regulation 123 list is to set out how infrastructure projects or types are expected to be funded. Predominantly, this is via SIL or Section 106 agreements. It's important that this is clear to everyone to avoid potential perceived double dipping. In other words, asking developers to contribute towards the same piece of infrastructure twice through different means. In undertaking this review, it has become evident that the current Regulation 123 list has ambiguity surrounding the funding of education provision. As such, the 2 proposed options put forward to members tonight are both revisions to ensure complete clarity and transparency in the Regulation 123 list, specifically on the matter of funding for primary education. 2 options are presented to members. Option A, which is Appendix 3 of the report, which explicitly details that Lenham Primary School expansion will be funded through Section 106 and therefore excluded from SIL. Or Option B, which is Appendix 4, where the word including is removed from the Regulation 123 exclusions list and the currently listed education schemes remain unaltered and exhaustive. This would mean that Lenham Primary School expansion would continue to be funded through potential SIL funds and not Section 106. This report recommends members agree Option A, which is specifying Lenham Primary School on the list of schemes excluded from SIL funding, for a 6-week statutory public consultation. This removes ambiguity over the wording of the current Regulation 123 list and will ensure the most appropriate form of funding for primary education in Lenham is secured.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Nicely explained. As I said, there is a statement from councillors Mr. and Mrs. Sams. It's not my statement. There are 8 points. I would just simply read them out to you. 1, SIL will be paid in any event by the developers. Those SIL contributions will be needed to fund a wide range of strategic infrastructure projects across the borough. 2, the proposed revision of the Regulation 123 list, as set out in Option A, will give the council clarity that it is appropriate to require developers at the Lenham Broad location H2 brackets 3 to fund a one-form entry expansion of Lenham Primary School. 3, the change will bring Lenham into alignment with the proposed funding for a new primary school within Maidstone Barracks Broad location H2 brackets 2, providing welcome consistency in decision making. 4, Option A is in line with Department of Education guidance seeking to ensure timely provision of school places as housing development proceeds. Option A is supported by KCC. 5, Countryside is proposing to submit a planning application for 360 dwellings at Lenham this summer. This application would, based on recent KCC estimates, provide a developer contribution of about £1 million, which would provide certainty that funding was in place to secure a significant expansion of primary school places at Lenham. By supporting option A, members will show that contribution to be requested will allow that contribution to be requested under section 106's. At a recent pre-app meeting, Countryside indicated that the company would be prepared to make the contribution if required by the Borough Council. 6, members are urged by Lenham Parish Council to support the revision proposed in option A and secure the provision of essential infrastructure to support the not inconsiderable level of growth proposed at Lenham. That's the statement. We have a member of the public wishing to speak. Mrs. Prendergast, would you like to come to the speakers table?
Thank you, Chairman, members, for allowing me the opportunity to speak. I've decided against reading my statement out because having heard what your officers have had to say this evening and what's written in your report, I think that cogent justification that Mr. Jarman promised to find for education provision to be included on the 1, 2, 3 list has certainly been highlighted, and I think that's really important. I mean, I'm simply here as a local member representing Lenham. I'm here really in the interests of current residents and future residents, and just to ensure that the right provision in terms of education is made as development commences. Many of you here will know that I've worked with officers from both authorities, from Maidstone Borough Council and Kent County Council, over many years to ensure that we get to this point. So I was delighted to see this and the recommendation 1 to add this to the Reg 123 list. Just a couple of things that I want to highlight, and some of those have been picked up by the SAMs in the statement you've just read out. The necessity for the school, I think, is quite clear. It's already been established. You've had it on your IDP as EDR 6 for a 2-form entry primary school, so that's not contentious at all. That the fact that it's now been revised down to a 1-form entry expansion to the current primary school is fantastic as well, because I think both authorities, officers from both authorities would agree that this is really related, reasonably related in scale and kind to the development that's coming forward. The written report also mentions just 1 or 2 other material planning or considerations for you. Mentions the new government guidance that came out for education provision in April this year. More specifically, which the report doesn't mention, that this guidance really does recommend that where we have 2-tier authorities, as we do here in Maidstone, and the planning functions are different and the infrastructure provision rests with 1, that Section 106 really is the most effective way, most effective mechanism for collecting funds for education provision. The report also mentions that as of September 1, the pooling restrictions are very likely to be lifted, so there is no restriction on just 5 developments paying for infrastructure through 106. Also, I was present at the pre-application meeting here just a few weeks ago for a development that's coming forward for in excess of 350 homes. And some of you who are present in this room were also present at that meeting, and you will have heard the applicant, when asked a very direct question about infrastructure funding for education provision, they said that they were both willing and able to do this via Section 106 if it met the legal requirements set by this council. So really, that's all I want to say, and I hope members will go with option A as recommended by your officers. And really, as I pointed out to Mr. Jarman a few weeks ago, there'll be future residents of Maidstone who will be thanking you for enabling them to attend a good local school within their own community. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Prendergast. Mr. Jarman, did you want to contribute?
Yes. One might say, why did the original 1, 2, 3 list not include the expansion of Lenham Primary School through Section 106s. Well, I know that you came along to Planning Committee on the 30th of May. I remember Councillor Munford speaking. The answers are very straightforward. Unlike Maidstone Barracks, unless I'm missing something, it's a single site in one ownership, and always has been. H110, big site, 800 houses, single site. Lenham, different beast entirely, as you said, Councillor Prendergast. In the very early Lenham neighbourhood plan, and that's the only stage we got, Regulation 14. It states 7 sites. So that is beyond the existing, or what was the existing, pooling restriction of 5. But I want to be very frank about this, because I don't think these decisions are as straightforward as one might expect. Now, you could say, let's move on. Pooling restriction has gone. Let's go back to Section 106s. Having dealt with many Section 106s, one of the problems with 106s is not all development comes at the same time, and you can't hold monies indefinitely. So I would say it's not necessarily a neat solution. And secondly, I know I don't want to get into details of pre-apps, but usually the developer is just reflecting the price, or usually the option price, that they've negotiated with the landowner. So 9 times out of 10, it's not actually the developer, it's actually the landowner who's taking the hit. But what I would say, because hopefully this won't happen in the future, but I'm experienced in this, is that at the end of the day, SIL is non-negotiable. You have to pay SIL. It's a roof tax. However, and I find this with affordable housing, which is supposed to be our #1 priority, Section 106, at the end of the day, is negotiable. So the things you prioritise the most, which I assume in Lenham is primary school first, maybe equal #1 with affordable housing, which has to be Section 106. When you're talking to certain developers and certain landowners, the only thing they can negotiate on is the Section 106 payments. And I would say, lastly, is that there's very high tests for Section 106, completely different with SIL. Thank you.
Your words of caution are listened to, but I still like the idea of holding the developers by their ankles and shaking them till all the money comes out of their pockets. And if this is a way of getting a double contribution, then I'm 100% behind it. Councillor Clark, would you like to speak?
Yes, Chairman. I wanted to bring attention to the fact that there are some errors on page 86 and 486 and 492. I'll start with 492 actually. The first item.
Just say it, Dave.
Sure. Okay. The reference number is Hotel Tango Victor Alpha 1. And that's on page 20 of the report, but 492 of our papers. The first row, it lists 2 policies in the local plan that were removed, which is H129 and H153. So it may be worth, instead of those, given they were removed at the inspection, it may be worth saying something along the lines of pressure from the south of Maidstone will add further pressure on, or development to the south of Maidstone will add further pressure on this junction, as you've done in several other instances. We've got the JTB coming up where we're looking at junctions. predominantly the improvements on this junction is the flows along the A229. So it is unlikely, as it's being proposed currently, to have much impact on Cripple Street or Borton Lane. And the planning references that are given in there are for planning refusals, which is HMA 139197. And also there's the Millwood Homes development, which was only passed because of our lack of 5-year housing supply. The government inspector didn't actually consider the traffic at that site. So those planning references actually aren't specific to this reference. But certainly those two sites need to be removed. There's another one on Hotel Tango Sierra Echo 6 and Hotel Tango Sierra Echo 7 on page 14 of the report, 486 of our papers, which is H129 in that row. All references to H129 and H153 should be removed from the report.
Mrs. Arnold.
Thank you very much for that feedback. I mean, in the interest of time this evening, and given that obviously for the purposes of the decision you're making tonight, this is the draft IDP, we'd be most welcome to receive the feedback of any inaccuracies that you feel are within the report. If you submit them to either myself or Helen, we'll sort of double check them and make those changes before it comes back to this committee as amended. It is a vast document, and whilst we've engaged with various infrastructure providers, there are elements that haven't obviously been picked up in terms of updating, but we'd be very keen to receive any detailed feedback by email before we bring it back to committee for agreement for publishing.
I think that translated as good spot, Councillor Clark, and we can amend it after the consultation period. Yes? So to be clear, that would effectively be taken as a consultation response.
For clarification, you are not being, the IDP is not being consulted upon. There is no legislative requirement to consult upon it. This committee has approved it for publication previously, and when we come back alongside the responses to the Reg 123 consultation, we will be asking this committee to publish it.
Right, so effectively put it into the evidence base with the corrections identified. Right.
Exactly.
That's nice and clear now, even to me. Thank you very much. With that in mind, I'm happy to move as per the papers here. Seconded by Councillor English. Those in favour? Unanimous and carried. Sorry, Councillor Mumford, I thought you were putting your hand up to... I will allow you to speak. So, apologies. You need to shout at me earlier.
I'll shout if you have a different system, but the system at the moment is to put your nameplate up, which mine was. So I'll change the system and I'll carry on shouting.
This sounds technical, but point it to me with the white bit of paper, because when it's on a certain angle and you only see the transfer, you can't see them.
Brief me later. I'd rather be rejected than forgotten was how I was going to start this off. I don't object to what's down here. It's just the way it ends up down here. Every member has got their own 1, 2, 3 list, and I would rather be rejected than forgotten. And it's the engagement of members, and we keep getting these papers in front of us, and they are a mystery until we open them up, and there's no engagement with members, and I'm sure all the members here and the, I'm not going to do the maths, the 55 members have all got their own 1, 2, 3 list, things that you might not be aware of. So that was my general point. My other point is quite minor, but it annoys me. The Lewes stream does not rise in Langley. Stream Shore rises in Langley, and it is Stream Shore, not Shore Stream. I will allow you to find it in the document.
Do you want to respond, Mrs. Arnold?
Could I just seek clarification? Is your issue that in terms of the Regulation 123 list, so Appendix 3 or 4, that you've not been engaged with, because there is only a very small change proposed within that, or is it around the infrastructure delivery plan, which I agree is a much bigger document, but all we have done is consult with the infrastructure providers to get an update on any changes in terms of supporting evidence to deliver the current local plan.
It is generally the infrastructure development. That's where I'm going with it. But time and time again, we get forgotten. And I just feel that documents that come before us we should be aware of, or at least had some input into. That's my feelings.
Okay,
You've
Mrs.
taken the
Arnold.
vote, and I wasn't going to vote against it. Not even because you've said that Lewes Stream rises in Langley.
I apologise, I missed you earlier.
So, Councillor Mumford, for a point of clarity, the only decision you're being asked to make this evening is whether you consult upon either Appendix 3 or Appendix 4. You're not being asked to make any decision whatsoever on the updates to the infrastructure delivery plan. That will come back for a decision later this year. So you've got sufficient time to digest it, and I've also, on the basis of the feedback from Councillor Clark, made the offer that if you have picked up any errors within it, to contact myself or Helen directly, Mrs. Smith, and we'll make sure that those are updated. But it should also be borne in mind that this document is purely being reviewed as part of our commitment to an annual review. The document already is in existence, and what we are doing is just bringing it into alignment with any new evidence that's come forward from infrastructure providers to deliver the current local plan. So it isn't a brand new document, it is one that has already been agreed, I believe, by this committee back in 2016, May 2016.
The good news is the door is still open, but thank you for that contribution, and that does conclude that item because the vote is already taken.
Can you clarify Councillor Mumford's vote for me?
For the sake of clarity, I will retake that vote. Those in favour? Unanimous and therefore carried. Item concluded. Thank you, Councillor Mumford. Agenda item 18, the operation of planning performance agreements, papers to be found at page 548. Mr. Jarman.
Just quickly, I'm recommending that we continue with the operation of planning performance agreements because, in my view, having received feedback from developers and councillors, they've been a success in terms of their use and the provision of the actual service.
That's how we like introductions, short and sweet. Councillor English, you're the only indication I see at the moment.
I don't want to belabour this. All I would say is that practice proves how things work. These are labour intensive for a fair number of members and officers and even for the developer. However, I think it's fair to say that although there was some scepticism, more than some in certain quarters, that these are proving successful, very successful. And with my planning committee hat on, I think that they are definitely adding significantly to the quality of most of the schemes. We do occasionally get a developer who, despite the process, doesn't really engage, but I think that would have been the case whatever method we dealt with them under. So I support the recommendation.
Councillor Mumford, I'm clearly seeing you on this occasion.
I'd reinforce what Councillor English said. I think they're brilliant. There's a lot of movement with the developers during it, and I would recommend that not only planning committee attend it, that ward councillors take up the option because they can get rid of a lot of problems. They are fantastic.
I'm afraid my position on this remains unaltered. You know, I can see that they're a tool, but the perception to the public of an arrangement where the developer passes to the council a significant sum of money that pays for the costs of the planning application and does not guarantee an outcome, but I remain deeply uncomfortable with these. It's a way of getting money in to fund the planning department. There are costs to be met. I just only wish that government would take the limits off of planning application fees and everybody paid the same fee, but it was appropriate no matter what. I don't like them.
Sorry, if I can just clarify a point there. It is not the purpose of PPAs to support or run the planning department. You can't do that in law. What you can do is you can recover costs to run that service. Otherwise, this would be illegal.
Well, I said I didn't like it. Councillor English.
I don't want to belabor the point, but from the point of view of members so far, experience so far, the major benefit has not been around costs or anything else, but has actually been in the heightened engagement and discussion. And I think it's unfortunate one or two particularly vocal members of the council who have come along to committee and shouted, including recently at P&R, are members who absolutely adamantly refuse to take part in these discussions and haven't been to many pre-apps either, and then they come along and wonder why their views haven't been taken into account because they haven't engaged in the process. So I think that I understand where you're coming from, Mr. Chairman, but I would say that the benefit to the council, to the public, and to parish councils who've been involved in these on occasion is actually improving the outcome, not in actually whatever financial or procedural benefit there is.
Mr. Jarman, can you remind me, do we actually publish the details of any PPAs that we enter into, or are they a confidential arrangement?
We don't publish on the website, but they're not confidential either. They are FOIable.
I just wonder if you would begin to allay some of my reticence for these things if actually all PPAs, the details of them, were published for the sake of public transparency.
Just to, on that point, our statement of community involvement deals with how we deal with PPAs, so it is already, and the statement of community involvement is part of our development plan, which has been passed by this council. So it's dealt with in there.
Councillor Wiggenden.
I mean, at the time I was also somewhat sceptical, and I asked the question about, would it, the fact of a PPA actually give more weight at a planning where sometimes it ought not, and Mr. Jarman, you've assured me that wouldn't be the case, and I take the point from Councillor English and others that actually these have been very successful in getting better applications through. So whilst I'm still slightly sceptical, I'm happy to go along with your assertions that actually these are working very well.
Sorry, 2 points for me, and it is set out in the report. Government's policy, and in my opinion quite rightly, is, and Councillor English was alluding to this, is to front load the system. And I think one of the sort of game changers in the NPPF is, I think councillors in particular, but to a large extent officers as well, could kind of sit back. But the government is saying, on the whole, growth is a good thing. Here's your opportunity, councillors and officers, at pre-application to change things, to shape things. So that means a degree of taking responsibility rather than sitting back and watching the game unfold, so to speak. Because, in my opinion, it's common sense, I guess, which Mr. Munford always reminds me of. Much better to solve a problem early doors than late on.
For the sake of clarity, my objections are not necessarily that we must talk to developers, because that sometimes is necessary in an appropriate environment with the appropriate safeguards. It's when a big sum of money it sits on the table that it just feels very uncomfortable to me.
I probably won't win you over, Chairman, but I remember exactly the same debate and much larger sums of money with Section 106 agreements, that developers were offering money for doctors' surgeries, etc., to buy their planning permission. But that was the
in
argument.
response to what the infrastructure providers tell us is needed to address the population increase, which is quite different, in my view. Anyway, that's just my view, and I'm not going to labour the point from the chair. Neither am I going to move the motion, so...
Can I propose the motion then?
Councillor English moves as per the papers. Yeah, as a seconder, you can reserve your right to speak. It's not closed yet.
All I would say to members is, without PPA, when you get to planning, you've got a fait accompli. With PPA, and I've attended most of them, if not nearly all of them, along with Councillor English, there is a hell of a lot of movement, both from the developers and the officers, and members can move a development to make it more acceptable.
I thought they were as much about, well, if you get this piece of work done by this time and this is the cost and this is how it'll be met, so that all the ducks get lined up in an efficient way, as much as it is about
I'm going to have to go in a couple of minutes. So
right, so moved, seconded. Those in favour? Those against? Abstentions, there are none. The motion is carried.
On the next.
Agenda item 19, section 106, legal agreements monitoring report. I'm sure Mr. Jarman is going to give us an equally succinct introduction.
Mr. Chairman,
minded that I know Mr. Councillor English would like to say something in connection with this.
Thank you, Chairman. Very conscious that the last monitoring report that I'm aware of, I think I'm right in saying, was reported to Planning Committee in February 2018. As everybody knows, Section 106 is the actual agreements themselves are part of the decision, so they're public documents, and perhaps more pertinently, the monies, in effect, are public monies. So I thought it was very important to be transparent for information, but I think it's important information to say to councillors, well, here it is. The operational reason why it's taken that length of time is because for the first, we've got an electronic system, monitoring system called Exicon. For the first time, every single Section 106 agreement is on this Exicon system, but in my opinion, more importantly, every single trigger point for every single Section 106 agreement is on Exicon. So the communication of this could have been slicker. I had a brief conversation with Councillor English earlier tonight. But for the first time, we've got a really solid foundation stone, and in the future, I'd like to report regularly to this committee, and to make the communication how we group Section 106's, basically how we present it, gets more specific and better quality in the future.
I have reflected on what Councillor English said earlier about the weight of this document being urgently admitted, allowing insufficient time to digest it. I also note that in the published version, the front page was omitted. Sounds like a small thing, but the document presented to us is different to the one that went to public consultation. But nothing else from me. Councillor English, I know you're on a deadline.
It's very important to have an informed discussion on this report, and I welcome the regular reporting. That's very useful, as indeed it is to Planning Committee when it happens. I would say that there's a number of questions and points that I think we could all very usefully reflect on with this discussion. The original report was, well, I won't go into that, but the urgent update appears at the brief glance time I've had to look at it to be much, much better. But I do think the best thing to do is to actually circulate the full amended set of papers so everyone can see them, because there's bound to be questions, comments, suggestions, and we cannot possibly just note the report tonight. I'm pleased to come back with this urgent update on the next committee agenda.
Mr. Jarman, were we to actually ask to defer this to the next meeting, are there any operation issues that presents to you?
Not for a sort of blended approach. What you've got in front of you as an urgent update was the old style report into Planning Committee, which has the RAG rate in. The detail you've got on your agenda papers is far more comprehensive than you've previously had, but what it's missing is the RAG rate in. But I can easily match the two to bring it back to September. Beyond that, and I didn't really want to go into operational detail,
I don't want to belabor this because I'm going to have to go, but I would be very grateful if you could, bring back the
members,
report.
I'm just looking for some consensus.
I think there may be some other points.
That we do defer this for proper consideration. Right, that item is deferred. Councillor Wiggenden?
However, I mean, there's one item on here which is very substantial, which looks like its spend by date is the 31st of August. Quite substantial. And therefore, by the time we discuss that again, that will be past its spend by date.
Mr. Jarman, a direct comment?
Well, yeah, as officers, it's hard not to mention resource here, but as officers, we do that anyway. All we're doing tonight, all I'm doing tonight, is just communicating the information we've got. That's why I struggle a bit about kind of morphing this into some kind of decision, because they are what they are at the end of the day.
I think for the purposes tonight, we're deferring because it's something fairly substantial that's landed, and to digest that adequately, we'll come back. That's not to say that it will be a forensic examination of the document next time, but we will have had chance to. And I would urge members, if there are queries on this, make those queries known directly to Mr. Jarman and his team between now and the next meeting so that we can be most informed. Last but not least, agenda item 20, outside body report. Mr. Nash, help us with this one.
Thank you, Chairman. So I'll try and keep this brief. This report and the table attached to Appendix 1 summarises the outside bodies that fall under the remit of the Strategic Planning and Infrastructure Committee. A number of automatic appointments have been made for this year, while some councillors still have time remaining on their term of office from previous appointments, so the committee are asked to note these this evening. All of the vacancies have recently been advertised to councillors, and the following nominations have been received. Councillor Patrick Garton for the Kent Downs AONB Joint Advisory Committee, and Councillor Clive English for the Maidstone Cycling Forum. The committee are asked to consider these nominations and make an appointment if appropriate. One point that I would like to raise is that during the course of this work, Democratic Services contacted all outside bodies, and when speaking with the communications manager at South Eastern Railway, it became clear that the South East Rail Passenger Group no longer exists in the same way as it was originally. A report will therefore be submitted to the Democracy and General Purposes Committee in September, and with the aim of removing this from the list of outside bodies in the Constitution. The Communications Manager did mention, however, that this had been superseded by the South Eastern Railway Stakeholder Forum, which is an informal meeting that meets twice a year, and it does not require a specific council representative. So therefore I've asked that all members of this committee get invited to these meetings to allow you to participate if you wish to. There's one outstanding vacancy on the Maidstone Cycling Forum and also a vacancy on the Medway Valley Line Steering Group. The committee could choose to identify a course of action to fill these vacancies. It could choose to nominate a member of this committee, or it could choose to re-advertise the vacancies to all councillors. And finally, I'd like to draw your attention to paragraphs 2.7 and 2.8 of the report. At the Democracy and General Purposes Committee on the 3rd of July, the principles for reviewing long-standing outside body vacancies were agreed. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Councillor DeWigan, did you want to? No. Okay, I think this item's pretty simple. We can note the report. They're uncontested nominations, so I'm sure we'll be able to support those that are received for those. The third item is actually asking us to identify a suitable means of fulfilling outstanding vacancies. I'm at a loss of what to suggest other than re-advertise. I mean, I'd also let you know I've been attending some of the meetings of the Cycle Forum. I've no wish to be an official person there. I want to be able to vote and consider all matters relating to without having an interest that could accrue by becoming part of it. So it's not like Cycle Forum engagements are not being attended, but this process doesn't necessarily recognise that. So what I'm kind of saying is we have got one formal representation. I'm not feeling that we desperately have to have the second one, but if we just re-advertise, if anybody has the inclination. So are we happy to note? Noted. And the nominations, we consider the nominations. Can we agree the nominations as per the papers I propose? Right. Is that a seconder, Councillor Mackay? Right, those in favour? Good old Clive. Anybody against?
Abstentions?
Abstention for the purpose of self-set. Right. Members, that concludes our agenda this evening. Thank you for your contributions, your considerations and your deliberations, and I am delighted to announce the meeting closed.
Did you vote on re-advertising outstanding?
Was it re-advertising?
It was just,
I can do it.
yeah.
So re-advertising. So what's that?
Well, in conversation.